Welcome everyone. My name's Lucas Draker and I'm here to talk you through the Law and Sexuality blog, and with me is the author, Surabhi Shukla.
Thanks, Luca. My name is Surabhi Shukla. I am a lecturer in law at the University of Sheffield. And for the last 7 years, I have been writing this particular blog on sexual orientation and gender identity cases in Indian courts. And I'm very happy here to get a chance to talk to Luca about the latest blog on intersex rights.
Excellent, thanks. So can you give us a brief introduction to the topic that you've chosen for this blog and the one that we're going to be discussing today?
Absolutely. So, the topic for the blog this time has been intersex rights. And typically, how I go about picking the topic is that I look for latest cases in the databases to see what's happening in the courts. So, this one caught my eye for this edition. This is a judgment of the Kerala High Court. Kerala is a state in the south of India. So, the Kerala High Court has given a judgment on whether the parents of an intersex child can, on their behalf, give permission for genital reconstruction surgery without the child's consent. And this seemed like a very interesting case to me because, to the best of my knowledge, intersex rights per se have not been considered by Indian courts. That is, um, so there have certainly been cases where intersex litigants have been before the courts, and if the chance arises, we can discuss them. But this particular question, which is at the center of intersex activism, has not been discussed directly by the courts. A PIL, a public interest litigation, is pending in the Indian Supreme Court. So this judgment is also timely because it can inform the arguments and ultimately the decision in the Indian Supreme Court.
So could you just give us what the legal definition of being intersex is, just so everyone's on the same page?
Yes, absolutely. So, intersex is not defined within Indian law, and unless there is specific legislation anywhere in any country, there is not a universally accepted legal definition. But there is a universally understood definition of intersex. An intersex person is, and there might be some variation from place to place, but more or less speaking, an intersexual person is a person who has a biological condition, and this biological condition is that either their chromosomal makeup or their external or internal sex organs are not in the typical formation of normative male or female sex organs. It could also be a different hormonal makeup than the typical male or female. So imagine that there is a list of criteria that you must fulfill biologically to be assigned male at birth and female at birth, and these children either have ambiguous genitalia or the genitalia don't conform to the typical boy child or girl child, or their chromosomes are different from the typicals. These conditions are called intersex condition. It's a biological condition. It is not per se a gender identity or sexual orientation issue, but it becomes one because of the medical interventions made by the doctors and the parents, and we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, because there's a really poignant part just at the start of your blog that really caught my eye. And that's where you put that these interventions are based on the idea that intersex conditions are not normal and need to be fixed. And that really jumped out at me because, again, that's going back to what we as society perceive as normal,
Hmm.
and then trying to kind of fix people towards what we believe it should be, as opposed to kind of allowing them to be themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. There is it becomes an issue because the medical regime and the parental regime starts to interfere. So in many cases, when the intersex child is born, and especially if their intersexual condition is visible, so it's an external, for example, say an ambiguous, somebody is born with an ambiguous genitalia, as was the case in this particular matter, then the doctors will take over and try to quote unquote correct the child so that they can align with a particular sex that the parents will choose, or that might be the practical way to go, easier to align, so on and so forth. It's based on the idea that these children are defective, and intersexuality has also been classified as a disorder of disorder of sexual difference, and therefore, and these categorizations remain. So it's based on an idea that this child has not been born correctly, but we can correct the child through medical intervention. But there has not been enough evidence to support that these interventions actually are required or that they are beneficial. In fact, there has been growing evidence to the contrary that these interventions cause lasting physical and psychological damage to the child.
I mean, obviously, it'd be slightly different if it was causing kind of physical harm to the child and it needed, and therefore medical intervention was needed. And but obviously, what we're
Yes,
looking at here is just like you say, it doesn't look the way we think it should look, so we're going to change it. Um,
exactly.
yeah, and that's what jumped out at me. Okay, so going a bit further down the blog, one of the main issues that's discussed is around consent, and that goes back to what we were just saying about kind of changing the defect, quote unquote. Um, is there a legal age for consent in general in India?
Yes, that's 18.
Okay.
At 18, you become an adult.
Because I know in the UK, there's like medical consent age is a bit more ambiguous, so that's why I just wanted to kind of ask that question. So the main kind of thrust of your blog talks about the law that incorrectly termed intersex people as transgender,
Yes.
but then has, and you'll probably do this a lot better than me, but basically has now means that those rights of transgender people have been kind of expanded to include intersex people.
Hmm.
And you termed it as two wrongs do make a right.
Sometimes.
So how did that come about?
So let me quickly go over the scenario of the case so that everyone's on the same page. So in this particular situation, what had happened was that the child was born with ambiguous genitalia and was around 7 years old at the time when the doctors recommended surgery, genital reconstruction surgery. And the parents wanted to consent to that. In fact, the parents consented to that. They were okay with it, and they said that, well, look, we are the parents. We know what's best for the child, and also it will help the family remain protected from stigma. And the child is also starting to notice these sexual differences. So, all in all, we don't want the child to be bullied or ostracized. We want to protect our family name, and we know what's best. Therefore, we would want the surgery to be performed on our child. And the doctors agreed that the surgery needs to be performed, but didn't want to perform one without court orders. So that's how the parents came before the Kerala High Court. Now, the Kerala High Court said that normally, in the case of parents seeking permission on behalf of the child, we are sympathetic to the parents because in many cases, parents do know what is best for the child. And in any case, there is a principle of best interest of the child. That is a legal principle that helps the court decide what to do in a situation where a child is involved. And in many instances, the interest of the child has been found to lie with the parents. So the court said it would not be unusual for us to grant permission on a general basis, but here we can't grant permission. And it says that if you look at the definition of transgender person, in the there is an act in India that protects transgender people from discrimination. It's called Transgender Person Protection of Rights Act 2019. So this act was enacted because in 2014 there was a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court had said that transgender people are entitled to all the fundamental rights that anybody else in the country is entitled to. And one of those rights is protection from discrimination. And it also laid down an array of other rights, such as, for example, reservation, etc., that that the transgender persons are entitled to. And it directed that these rights be provided to the transgender persons. Compliance with those directions, the union government, the central government, has enacted this Transgender Act. Now, what happened in the Supreme Court decision was that it defined transgender people to include intersex people. Now, this was a mistake because theoretically speaking, Since transgender is a gender identity issue, what is my true gender? That is what a transgender question would sound like. An intersex person may or may not be transgender, just like any of us. Because an intersex condition is a biological or medical condition or a medical variation of how you are born. But there is also the fact that it is not unusual, or it also happens sometimes, that when an intersex child is born, parents abandon that child because they are afraid of the stigma and ostracization, more in cases of ambiguous genitalia, etc., with intersexual condition that is externally visible. Or they hand the child over to the transgender community, say the Hijra community, for example. It's because there is a false association that is popular in India, and my hope is that the understanding must be changing, but this was a popular association made on the ground level that a transgender person is a person who has ambiguous genitalia. So these two false ideas feed into each other, basically. A false idea about who's a transgender person, because the slang for a transgender person in Hindi is also the Hindi word for eunuch, and eunuch is understood as a person who is castrated, and then by extension, by some other modifications, also people who have ambiguous genitalia, etc. So this false idea of who a transgender person is and this false idea of what intersexuality is together sometimes results in the situation that parents give away their intersex child to the trans community. So it is possible, and this is the sense that I get when I talk to activists and try to understand why did the Supreme Court include intersex people in the definition of transgender. And this is one of the reasons that comes up in that discussion, that this is probably why. Because even if intersex people are not transgender, they might face some of the same kinds of discrimination and ostracization because they are incorrectly understood as transgender and sometimes abandoned by their families and given over to the trans communities. So let's say that this was the reason why. Now, what happened as a result of the Supreme Court definition of transgender was that when the central government started to enact a legislation for the protection of transgender people, it took that definition from the Supreme Court judgment. So, as the Supreme Court judgment said that transgender people included intersex people, the legislation also says that transgender persons include intersex people. And one of the things that the legislation prohibits is harming transgender people or injuring transgender people, and therefore, by extension, harming or injuring intersex people. And it was because of this logic that the court said that, well, usually I would have allowed you because you're the parent, but my hands are tied because of the Transgender Act. Now, this is my interpretation of what the court says because this is how the court words it. But the court is also aware of the harms. But because the court must necessarily be aware that these surgeries are harmful and injurious for the scope for the court to understand that, well, if these surgeries are going to be performed, the child is going to be harmed, and causing harm to an intersex child is prohibited by this act. If the court had not seen these surgeries as harmful at all, the court would have not read that the act protected the intersex child in the same way.
Mm.
So I think that while the act played a major role in tying the hands of the court or prompting it to give this positive judgment, it would not have been without the court's own understanding of harm as well, which included genital reconstruction surgeries as causing harm. Because the act nowhere says that, genital reconstruction surgeries are harm. It is the court reading
Yeah.
genital reconstruction surgeries as harm and therefore saying, well, you're not allowed to harm intersex children, therefore we won't allow you. I think it's a little bit of both. But what I was trying to say with two wrongs making a right was that first it was a Supreme Court judgment getting the definition of transgender people wrong. And then second it was the central government, the parliament enacting that false judgment into legislation that ultimately saved the day. Because intersex people have been saying for a long time that, look, no reconstruction surgeries without our consent.
It's a fascinating case. So what is the process with the case now? What's the next steps for this?
So what the Kerala High Court said was it directed that the state government should set up a committee comprising of doctors and psychiatrists. Unfortunately, no intersex person was required to be a member of the committee, which is unfortunate because that is where you can get the lived experience aspect of these surgeries. And it's not that they are not aware that committees can include intersex people, because in Tamil Nadu, which is another southern Indian state, the court had also directed in another case, which was not directly on the surgery issue but a different issue, that for intersex people there should be a committee, and it should have doctors and psychiatrists but also an intersex activist or an intersex person. So there are models existing in the country already where intersex representation is required on committee, but not in this one. And the committee is now then charged with examining every case on a case to case basis, and only allowing doctors to go ahead with surgeries without consent when it is a threat to the life of the child, as you had earlier mentioned, Luca, that in some cases it might be necessary to protect the child's life, and it might not be possible to wait for consent. And so in those cases, in life threatening situations, the committee can give the go ahead, and then the doctors can perform. But it's supposed to be a case by case analysis. And the court has also asked the government to pass a general order banning these surgeries, generally speaking. But when I last checked last week with activists and generally on news, the government portal and news sites, no such order seems to have come through yet. So there is a very haphazard regime in the country with, for example, a place like Tamil Nadu where the order exists. Hopefully, the order has meant that intersex surgeries are now the exception, but rather than the norm. But in other places, I'm imagining that the same regime is still prevalent, which is that the doctors take over.
Okay, so what would you say is your takeaway from reading about this case and doing a bit more research around it?
My takeaway is that this decision has come at the right time because there is a litigation pending in the Supreme Court on intersex rights. And there is no legislation that is countrywide on intersex rights. And therefore, hopefully, this particular decision informs that Supreme Court litigation. And even if it is based on the same slightly faulty understanding of transgender, it would still work. So I think that I'm hopeful. This is an interesting time for intersex rights.
I was going to say, I mean, at least there's protection being there. It might not be in the, like you say, it might not be in the right format given the fact that they've incorrectly been defined, but the fact that the protection is there, and like you said, the interpretation of it, of those surgeries being harmful, is quite important as well. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for also doing the research as well. If anybody's listening, to those who are listening, your blog, it comes out every 2 months. Is that correct?
Yes, once every 2 months.
And if anybody's got any questions, use the website. There's contact details on there, and we look forward to kind of listening to your next one.
Thank you. I'm also on Instagram by my name, so you can I try and make a little post on every blog, so you can check it out there as well if you like. Yeah,
Excellent.
I'm excited. Let's see what happens. And thanks, Luca, for taking the time to talk to me about this.
No problem. It's fascinating. I've already learnt loads of things just from reading that one blog. So thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.